On March 10th of 2026, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, one of the most respected nonpartisan fiscal watchdog organizations in the United States, published a report with a title that should have stopped every American in their tracks. They called it Break Glass, a plan for the next economic shock. Break glass, as in break glass in case of emergency. As in, this is no longer a warning about something that might happen someday. This is a blueprint for what to do when the crisis arrives, and the opening line of that report contained a sentence that I need you to hear clearly. They wrote, "The U.S. has never experienced an economic shock as indebted as we are today. This situation leaves the U.S. immensely vulnerable." Never. In the entire 250-year history of the United States of America. Not during the Great Depression, not during World War II, not during the stagflation of the 1970s, not during the dot-com crash, not during the 2008 financial crisis, not during the pandemic. At no point in the history of this country has the federal government been this indebted going into a crisis. When the dot-com bubble burst in the early 2000s, U.S. debt was 34% of GDP and the government was running a surplus. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, debt was 35% of GDP. When the pandemic struck in 2020, debt was 80% of GDP. Today, debt is 100% of GDP. Deficits are nearly 6% of GDP. Interest payments consume almost 1/5 of all federal revenue. And the CRFB warned that our dismal fiscal outlook, in combination with lingering inflationary pressures and ongoing Treasury market volatility, makes crafting any response to a potential future economic shock extremely difficult. In plain English, America is one event away from the worst crisis in its history, and when that event arrives, the government that is supposed to protect you has fewer tools, less money, more debt, and less credibility than at any prior crisis point in American history. And that event could come from any one of 6 different directions. And at least 3 of those directions are already showing stress fractures right now, today in April of 2026. It is closer than you think, and I'm going to walk you through every single one of them. The 6 crises the CRFB says could hit America and why the country cannot afford any of them. The CRFB report outlined 6 distinct types of fiscal crisis that the United States could experience, and they warned that the country could experience any one of them or some combination of them simultaneously. The first is a financial crisis, in which investors lose confidence in the U.S. Treasury market, interest rates spike uncontrollably, existing bonds lose value, and cascading failures at banks and financial institutions ripple through the economy, making it difficult for individuals and businesses to make payments or receive loans. The CRFB specifically cited the 2023 collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, Silvergate Bank, Signature Bank, and First Republic Bank as a small-scale preview of how a rapid increase in Treasury rates can destabilize the banking sector. That preview destroyed 4 banks and required emergency federal intervention. The full-scale version, triggered by a genuine loss of confidence in Treasury debt, would be orders of magnitude worse. The second type of crisis is an inflation crisis in which the government resorts to printing money or keeping interest rates artificially low to manage its debt burden, which debases the currency and causes prices to spiral upward. The third is an austerity crisis, in which the government is forced to slash spending and raise taxes simultaneously to restore fiscal credibility, which causes an immediate and severe economic contraction. The fourth is a currency crisis, in which the dollar loses its global reserve status and import prices surge while foreign governments dump their treasury holdings. The fifth is a default crisis, the most catastrophic of all, in which the federal government fails to make principal or interest payments on its debt. The CRFB wrote that in a large-scale default scenario, banks would fail, credit markets would freeze, stock markets would crash, pension funds would default, and countries around the world would enter deep recessions. And the sixth is what they call a gradual crisis, in which no single acute event occurs but high debt slowly crowds out investment, depresses growth, and reduces real income per person by an estimated 8% by 2050, according to Congressional Budget Office models. That is the Japan scenario. Japan has sustained extremely high debt for decades without a visible crisis, but its real GDP has grown only 10% total over the past 2 decades, averaging 0.5% per year. That is not a crisis in the traditional sense. It is a generation-long stagnation in which an entire population quietly becomes poorer without a single dramatic event to explain why. And any one of these 6 crises can be triggered by a single event. The CRFB listed the trigger events explicitly. The popping of an asset bubble in real estate, equities, AI, or digital assets. An unexpected loss of consumer confidence. A supply shock caused by policy choices or external events. A fiscal or monetary policy error. A failure of financial institutions. A de-anchoring of inflation expectations. A fiscal crisis caused by Treasury market turmoil. Or a black swan event such as a natural disaster, war, or collapse of a major industry. And as I stand here in April of 2026, at least 4 of those trigger events are either already underway or closer to occurring than at any point in modern American history. And here is the context that makes the CRFB's 6 crisis framework especially terrifying for ordinary Americans. They are not describing theoretical possibilities. They are describing events that have happened to real countries in living memory. Argentina experienced a financial crisis in 1998 when investors lost confidence in its government debt, triggering cascading bank failures and a 75% devaluation of its currency. Greece experienced an austerity crisis in 2009 when bond markets froze and the government was forced to slash spending by 30%, triggering unemployment that peaked at 27.5%. Brazil experienced a fiscal crisis in 2016 driven by ballooning government debt and political dysfunction. Turkey experienced an inflation and currency crisis in 2021 to 2022 when the president fired 3 central bank governors and inflation hit 85% while the lira lost 95% of its value. Russia defaulted on its debt in 1998. Every single type of crisis in the CRFB's framework has happened to a major economy in the past 30 years. The United States has been protected primarily by the dollar's reserve status, the depth of its Treasury market, and the credibility of the Federal Reserve. All 3 of those protections are weaker today than at any time since they were established. The dollar's share of global reserves has dropped from 71% to 59%. The Treasury market is experiencing volatility not seen since the 2019 repo crisis. And the Federal Reserve is under political pressure that 3 former chairs have publicly compared to emerging market authoritarianism. The shields are still there, but they are thinner, and the CRFB is warning that they may not hold if the next shock is large enough. The trigger that is already pulling, the Strait of Hormuz, is still not fully open, and 20% of the world's oil just became a geopolitical weapon. The CRFB drafted their break glass report before the United States and Israel struck Iran with airstrikes on February 28 of 2026. Since then, Iran has repeatedly disrupted passage through the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which approximately 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas flows from the Persian Gulf to the rest of the world. More than 80 energy facilities across the Gulf were damaged during the conflict, including refineries, terminals, upstream production, and pipelines. The International Energy Agency reported that more than a third of those facilities were severely damaged and estimated it could take up to 2 years to restore output. OPEC plus crude production dropped from roughly 25 million barrels per day to under 20 million. Brent crude surged above $100 per barrel from a pre-war price of approximately $65. On March 11th, the IEA agreed to release 400 million barrels from strategic reserves, the largest coordinated stock draw in the agency's 51-year history. And as of mid-April 2026, the Strait of Hormuz remains a contested waterway. The U.S. Navy is conducting operations to reopen it. Iran has issued public warnings that it considers the strait part of its territorial waters. And the uncertainty about whether the strait will remain open, partially open, or closed again at any point in the next 12 months is the single largest supply-side shock to the global economy since the 1973 OPEC embargo. An oil supply disruption of this magnitude, sustained for more than a few weeks, triggers a cascade. Diesel prices rise, trucking costs rise, food prices rise, heating costs rise, manufacturing input costs rise, airline costs rise. Consumer confidence collapses because every visible price in everyday life goes up simultaneously and visibly. And the Federal Reserve, which is already under political pressure to cut interest rates, faces an impossible choice. If they cut rates to support the economy, they risk reigniting inflation that is being fed by the oil shock. If they hold rates steady, the economy contracts under the weight of higher energy costs and tighter credit. If they raise rates to fight the oil-driven inflation, they trigger the financial crisis that the CRFB warned about because higher rates devalue the existing bond portfolios of every bank in America. There is no good option. There is only the choice of which crisis you prefer, and that choice is being made right now, in real time, while most Americans are focused on the next news cycle about something that does not matter. The trigger that is loading. The AI bubble is the largest concentration of capital in a single narrative since the dot-com era, and it is financed with $3 trillion in debt. The Magnificent Seven, Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, Alphabet, Amazon, Tesla, and Meta have driven more than 50% of S&P 500 gains since 2020. More than 30% of the total market capitalization of the S&P 500 is concentrated in just those 7 companies. That level of concentration means that a correction in those 7 stocks is not a sector rotation, it is a market crash. Because every 401k, every pension fund, every target date retirement fund, every index fund in America is weighted toward those 7 names. When they go down, everything goes down. And the AI build-out that justifies their current valuations requires an estimated $3 trillion in capital investment by 2030, according to industry analysts. Much of that capital is being financed with debt. Data centers, the physical infrastructure of AI, are some of the most capital-intensive facilities ever built, requiring massive investments in land, electricity, cooling, and networking in addition to the chips and servers themselves. Data centers are expected to account for 10% of U.S. power demand by 2030, up from approximately 2% today. That 5-fold increase in electrical demand is creating strain on regional grids that is already visible in higher electricity prices in Virginia, Texas, and the Pacific Northwest, where data center construction is concentrated. And the question that the entire AI investment thesis depends on has not been answered. The CRFB flagged it. ING Economics flagged it. Capital Economics flagged it. The question is whether AI companies can actually monetize their investments at a scale that justifies the capital expenditure. If AI fails to generate the returns that Wall Street is pricing into current stock valuations, the correction will not be gradual. It will be violent. Because the valuations are not based on current earnings, they are based on projected future earnings that assume AI transforms every industry in the economy simultaneously within 5 to 10 years. If that transformation takes 15 to 20 years instead, or if it generates productivity gains that are real but modest, the gap between the projected earnings and the actual earnings will cause a repricing that could take 30 to 50% off the market capitalization of the companies that are currently holding the entire index up. Michael Burry has placed 80% of his portfolio in bets against Nvidia and Palantir. Jeremy Grantham has called this the 4th super bubble in American history. And the Shiller-Cape ratio, which measures the price of the S&P 500 relative to its inflation-adjusted earnings over the prior decade, has been at levels exceeded only by the 2000 dot-com peak. Every historical indicator that has reliably predicted the end of a bubble is currently flashing. And the difference between this bubble and 2000 is that in 2000 the federal government had a surplus and debt was 34% of GDP. Today, the federal government has a $1 trillion annual deficit and debt is 100% of GDP, which means the government's ability to cushion the landing after the bubble pops is a fraction of what it was the last time this happened. The trigger hiding in plain sight, total U.S. debt has reached $98.8 trillion and nobody is counting all of it. The number that appears on the news is the federal debt, $36 trillion, or $37 trillion depending on the week. That number is terrifying by itself, but it is not the real number. The real number, the one that captures the full scope of American indebtedness, is $98.8 trillion. That is the total of all debt in the United States economy as of the second quarter of 2025, which includes federal government debt at $37.5 trillion, or 123% of GDP, non-financial corporate debt at $21.9 trillion, or 72% of GDP, financial corporate debt at $20.9 trillion, or 69% of GDP, and household debt at approximately $20 trillion, or 66% of GDP. Combined, that is 324% of GDP. For every dollar the American economy produces in a year, there are $3.24 of debt attached to it, and every one of those debt categories is at or near its all-time high. Household debt is at a record. Corporate debt is at a record. Federal debt is at a record. And the interest rates being charged on all of that debt are dramatically higher than they were 3 years ago. Credit card. APRs average 22.76%. Auto loan rates are above 7% for new vehicles and above 11% for used. Mortgage rates have been hovering near 7%. Corporate bond yields are elevated, and the federal government is paying over $1 trillion per year in interest on its debt alone. Ray Dalio described this as debt service payments squeezing away buying power, like plaque in the arteries, and warned that eventually the system suffers what he called an economic heart attack. And the arterial analogy is precisely right, because the $98.8 trillion in total debt does not cause a visible crisis every day. It causes a slow, steady compression of the economy's ability to grow, to invest, to absorb shocks, and to recover from disruptions. Every dollar of debt service is a dollar that is not spent on consumption, investment, hiring, research, or infrastructure. And when the total debt burden reaches 324% of GDP, the compression is severe enough that even a modest external shock, a 10% correction in equity markets, a $20 increase in the price of oil, a 50 basis point spike in Treasury yields can trigger a chain reaction that cascading failures across multiple sectors simultaneously. That is the definition of systemic fragility. And $98.8 trillion is the number that measures it. Not $36 trillion, not the federal debt alone, the total, all of it. Because in a crisis, all of it matters. The family that cannot pay its mortgage defaults, the bank that holds the mortgage takes a loss. The corporation that borrowed to build the data center cannot refinance. The pension fund that holds the corporate bond takes a loss. The retiree whose pension is reduced cuts spending. The small business that depended on that spending lays off workers. The laid-off worker cannot pay their credit card. The credit card issuer takes a loss. And the cascade continues until the government steps in with a bailout financed by borrowing more money on top of the $37.5 trillion it already owes. That is the spiral. And the CRFB is telling you in their own words that the country has never been this close to the edge of it. The trigger. Nobody talks about private credit is the new shadow banking system, and it is growing faster than anyone can monitor. Capital Economics, one of the most respected independent research firms in the world, identified private credit as the single most likely source of the next financial crisis. Private credit refers to loans made outside the traditional banking system by private equity firms, hedge funds, business development companies, and other non-bank lenders. These institutions have grown explosively since 2010, filling the gap left by banks that were forced to tighten lending standards after the 2008 crisis. The private credit market has grown to approximately $1.7 trillion in assets under management globally, with the majority concentrated in the United States. And the critical problem with private credit is that it operates outside the regulatory framework that governs banks. Private credit funds are not subject to the same capital requirements, stress testing, disclosure rules, or federal oversight that apply to J.P. Morgan or Bank of America. Their loans are illiquid, meaning they cannot be easily sold on a secondary market. Their valuations are often model-based rather than market-based, which means the losses are invisible until the fund is forced to market, at which point the losses appear all at once. And the borrowers in the private credit universe are overwhelmingly mid-market and lower middle market companies with weaker credit profiles than the companies that can access public bond markets. When the economy slows, these are the first companies to default. And when they default, the losses are concentrated in a small number of funds that are connected to the broader financial system through relationships with banks, insurance companies, and pension funds that have invested in private credit as an _quote_6_ asset class. The World Economic Forum's Global Risks Report for 2026 specifically warned that trouble emerging from shadowy parts of the system, in particular private credit and related structures that have grown rapidly in size and importance and yet remain lightly supervised, represents one of the most significant financial risks of the year. A single large private credit fund blowing up would not, by itself, cause a recession. But a cluster of defaults in private credit triggered by an economic slowdown, an oil shock, or a spike in interest rates could freeze credit markets in a way that is structurally similar to what happened in 2008 when the mortgage-backed securities market seized. The mechanism is the same. Opaque, illiquid, leveraged instruments that are connected to the broader financial system through counterparty relationships that nobody fully understands until the crisis reveals them. In 2008, it was subprime mortgages packaged into CDOs. In 2026, it could be middle market corporate loans packaged into private credit funds. The packaging is different, the leverage is the same, the opacity is the same, and the systemic risk is the same. And the growth rate of private credit should alarm every American with exposure to the financial system. In 2008, the subprime mortgage market that destroyed the global economy was approximately $1.3 trillion. Private credit has already surpassed that threshold at $1.7 trillion and is projected to reach $2.8 trillion by 2028. The institutions investing in private credit include some of the largest pension funds in America, including the California Public Employees Retirement System, the Teacher Retirement System of Texas, and state pension systems across the country. These pension funds moved into private credit precisely because traditional bonds were yielding too little during the zero-rate era. They were chasing yield. And yield chasing in opaque, illiquid markets is the single most reliable precursor to financial crises in the historical record. It preceded the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s. It preceded the long-term capital management collapse of 1998. It preceded the subprime crisis of 2007 to 2008. And it is happening again right now, at scale, in a market that most Americans have never heard of with their pension money. The trigger that terrifies economists more than any other. A de-anchoring of inflation expectations that turns a price shock into a price spiral. Every central bank on Earth operates on a single foundational principle. The principle is that the public believes inflation will return to the target rate. If the public believes inflation will be 2%, then workers accept wage increases of 2 to 3%. Businesses set prices expecting 2% input cost increases, and the economy self-regulates around the target. That belief is what economists call, quote, 8. When those expectations become de-anchored, meaning the public stops believing that inflation will return to target and starts expecting permanently higher prices, the self-regulation breaks. Workers demand 6% raises because they expect 5% inflation. Businesses raise prices 7% because they expect their input costs to rise 6%. And the expectation of inflation causes the actual inflation, which then reinforces the expectation, which causes more inflation. That is a wage price spiral. And once it starts, the only way to stop it is a deliberate recession, which is what Paul Volcker engineered in 1981 to 1982 by raising interest rates to 20% and throwing 10 million Americans out of work. The CRFB identified de-anchoring of inflation expectations as one of the explicit trigger events for the worst crisis in American history. And the conditions for de-anchoring are more favorable right now than at any time since the 1970s. Inflation remains above the Federal Reserve's 2% target at approximately 2.7 to 3%. Oil prices spiked above $100 due to the Iran conflict. Tariff policy has introduced uncertainty into import pricing across thousands of product categories. And the political pressure on the Federal Reserve to cut rates regardless of the inflation data is publicly visible and historically unprecedented, with 3 former Fed chairs publicly comparing the current situation to emerging market authoritarianism. If the public comes to believe that the Fed has lost its independence and will cut rates for political reasons rather than economic ones, inflation expectations de-anchor. Because the public correctly understands that a politically captured central bank will choose lower rates and higher inflation over higher rates and lower inflation, because lower rates are politically popular even when they are economically destructive. And the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Survey has already shown a sharp increase in long-term inflation expectations over the past 18 months. Consumers are beginning to price in the possibility that inflation will not return to 2% in any reasonable time frame. If that belief hardens, the spiral begins. And once it begins, it cannot be stopped without the kind of pain that no politician in either party is willing to impose. The Volcker recession of 1981 to 1982 was the last time America deliberately broke the inflation spiral. Unemployment peaked at 10.8%. The political cost was enormous, and the debt-to-GDP ratio at the time was approximately 30%, which gave the government fiscal space to absorb the pain. Today, debt is 100% of GDP. There is no fiscal space. A Volcker-style recession in 2026 would require a government that is already borrowing $1 trillion per year to borrow dramatically more to fund unemployment insurance, SNAP expansion, and emergency assistance for the millions of Americans who would lose their jobs. And the borrowing required to fund the recession would add to the debt that caused the fiscal fragility that made the recession necessary. The loop, again, is self-reinforcing. And the exit from this loop requires political courage that does not currently exist in Washington. What the CRFB is actually telling America and why their words should keep every American awake tonight. Let me read you the most important paragraph in the entire CRFB report, translated into plain English. They wrote that too often lawmakers wait for the emergency to happen before thinking through how they might react. Then, once the economy recovers, they move on. These crisis-driven responses can be costly and haphazard and, in some cases, may solve one problem while creating another. That sentence is the most damning indictment of American governance I have read in a nonpartisan policy document in my career covering economics. A nonpartisan watchdog is telling the United States Congress on the public record that the country's response pattern to economic emergencies is to panic, overspend, create new problems, and then forget about the consequences until the next emergency arrives. And they are telling Congress that this pattern has accumulated to the point where the next emergency will find a country that cannot afford to panic and overspend because the previous panics and overspending have consumed all of the fiscal capacity that would have been available to respond. The national debt increased by 65 percentage points of GDP across just the last two recessions and their recoveries. In 2000, we entered the recession with 34% debt to GDP. By 2020, after two crisis responses and two recoveries, it was 80%. After one more crisis response and one more recovery, it is 100%. Where does it go after the next one? If the pattern holds, debt to GDP goes to 130% or higher. And at 130%, the interest payments alone would consume so much of the federal budget that funding for defense, Medicare, Social Security, infrastructure, education, Veterans Affairs, and every other function of the federal government would be mathematically impossible without either printing money or defaulting on obligations. That is not a political opinion. That is arithmetic. And the arithmetic does not care which party you vote for. It does not care whether you support tax cuts or tax increases. It says that at 130% debt to GDP with interest rates above 4%, both paths lead to crisis. And the CRFB is telling America in the clearest possible language a nonpartisan institution can use that the arithmetic is closing in. The window in which meaningful fiscal reform could prevent the worst outcome is measured in years, not decades. And the current fiscal legislation, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, added an estimated $4.7 trillion to the debt through 2035. That legislation did not narrow the window. It widened the canyon. America is one event away from a crisis it cannot afford to fight. One oil shock, one asset bubble pop, one private credit freeze, one Treasury market seizure, one de-anchoring of inflation expectations, one policy error, one war, one natural disaster, one loss of confidence by the global investors who fund 30% of the federal debt. Any one of those events, arriving into the most indebted government in American history with the most constrained fiscal space, the most politically compromised Federal Reserve, and the most concentrated stock market in modern memory, could trigger the worst economic crisis this country has ever experienced. And the people who are supposed to prevent that crisis are the same people who created the conditions for it. They are the same people who spent the surplus, who added $4.7 trillion, who failed to raise the FDIC limit, who drained the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, who let the infrastructure decay, who allowed the debt to reach 100% of GDP in peacetime during an expansion. And they are the same people who will ask for your vote in November and tell you that everything is fine. It is not fine. The CRFB is telling you it is not fine. The rating agencies are telling you it is not fine. The Federal Reserve's own balance sheet is telling you it is not fine, and the $98.8 trillion in total American debt is telling you it is not fine. Share this video with every American you know, not for the algorithm. Because the information in this video is the difference between a household that sees the trigger events developing and a household that discovers the crisis when their bank freezes withdrawals, their 401k drops 40%, their mortgage rate resets, or the grocery store down the street runs out of diesel to receive its next shipment. Nobody should discover this in the wreckage. Subscribe and turn on notifications because I am going to keep tracking every CRFB report, every Treasury auction, every private credit development, every inflation expectation reading, every Middle East development, and every fiscal decision that moves America closer to or further from the edge. No spin, no party line. Just the truth about the financial future of this country and what it means for your money. Take care of yourselves out there. The most expensive commodity in America right now is time, and you have less of it than you think. Here is what you do with the time you have left before the next trigger event arrives. Review your portfolio concentration. If more than 30% of your retirement savings is indexed to the S&P 500 without any counterweight, you are making a concentrated bet on 7 companies whose valuations depend on AI-generating returns that have not been proven. Consider whether an equal-weighted index or a diversified allocation across value, international, and fixed income makes more sense for your risk tolerance. Pay down variable rate debt. Every dollar of credit card debt at 22%, every dollar of HELOC debt tied to the prime rate, every dollar of adjustable rate mortgage debt is a ticking time bomb if interest rates spike during a crisis response. Spread your cash across multiple FDIC-insured institutions. The $250,000 limit per depositor per institution is absolute and has not been adjusted since 2010. Build a 90-day emergency fund if you do not already have one. In the 2008 crisis, the median duration of unemployment for workers over 55 was 35 weeks. In the next crisis, with a more constrained government response capacity, it could be longer. Stock your pantry with shelf-stable food. Keep your gas tank above half. Know where your important documents are. These are not prepper fantasies. These are the same preparations that FEMA recommends for natural disaster readiness. And a financial crisis is a disaster that arrives without a weather forecast. The only warning you get is the warning I'm giving you right now in this video with data published by the most credible nonpartisan institutions in the country.